Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she had exactly $11, a cracked leather bag, and a secret she could not afford to let anyone find out. The year was 1882. The town of Harrow Creek, Ohio, was the kind of place that swallowed women whole, especially women who had made the mistake of marrying the wrong man the first time around. She had not planned to become a mail-order bride. That was not the dream she had carried as a girl, pressing wildflowers between the pages of her mother's Bible and believing that love would find her the way spring finds the earth, quietly, surely, without force. But love had not found her that way. Love had found her through Thomas Wick, a charming man with soft hands and hard fists, and by the time she understood what he truly was, her name was already on his deed, her body already bearing the proof of his rage. The advertisement had been folded into the back of a church pamphlet that a stranger left on the pew beside her. She had not meant to read it. But her eyes, always searching for something, an escape, a window, a crack in the wall, had found the words before her mind could stop them. Seeking a woman of honest character and sound disposition. Will provide home, safety, and respectful partnership. Apply to Chief Running Bear, Elk Ridge Territory, Montana. She had stared at those words for so long that the candle beside her burned down to a stub. Chief Running Bear. The name alone should have frightened her. Everything she had been told about native men by the people of Harrow Creek was soaked in fear and ugliness. But fear, she had come to understand, was not always a warning. Sometimes it was a habit. And she had enough real fear in her life, the kind that came in the shape of a man who smelled of whiskey and arrived home after midnight, that a name on a piece of paper held no real terror for her anymore. She wrote the letter on a Tuesday. Her hand shook as she addressed the envelope. She told herself she was only curious. She told herself she would never actually send it. But on Wednesday morning, before Thomas woke, she slipped out to the post office with her cracked bag pressed against her ribs and slid the envelope through the brass slot before she could think twice. She heard it fall. She heard the soft sound it made at the bottom of the pile. And something inside her chest, something that had been locked for a very long time, shifted just slightly, like a door that had not been touched in years, moving a single inch on its rusted hinges. She did not expect a reply. She did not allow herself to hope. Hope was the most dangerous thing she owned, more dangerous than the bruises Thomas left on her arms, more dangerous than the nights she lay still as stone beside him and prayed for morning. Hope had a way of collapsing on you. It had a way of making the fall worse. But 6 weeks later, a letter arrived. Clean paper. Careful handwriting. Words that were simple and direct and carried inside them something she had not felt in years, dignity. He wrote that he had a home near the river. That the land was wide and the sky was wider. That he was a man of his word and he expected nothing from a wife that she was not willing to give. That he had known loss himself, and did not believe in adding to another person's suffering. She read that letter 7 times. Then she hid it in the lining of her boot and began to plan. Leaving was not a single moment. It was 100 small ones, each one more terrifying than the last. It was the morning she slipped her mother's ring off the kitchen windowsill while Thomas slept. It was the afternoon she sold her good wool coat to the widow Marsh for $3.50 and told herself she did not need warmth where she was going, she needed distance. It was the night she lay beside Thomas for the last time and stared at the ceiling and made herself memorize every crack in the plaster so that she would never, not even once, feel tempted to come back and look at it again. She left on a Thursday, in the gray hour before the sun decided whether it would rise. She wore her second-best dress, the blue one with the fraying hem, and she carried her cracked bag and $11 and the letter in her boot. She did not leave a note. There was nothing she could say to Thomas Wick that she had not already said with her bruises, her silence, and the 3 years of her life she had given him like coins dropped into a well, gone, without a wish granted. The train station was 4 miles from their house. She walked all 4 of them. Her feet were wet by the time she arrived, and her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She bought a ticket to St. Louis with the first leg of her journey, and then from St. Louis she would connect through to Montana Territory, a name that felt like a foreign country, a place that existed in the same way that fairy tales existed, true enough to believe in, too distant to fully understand. On the train she sat very still. Every time the door at the end of the car opened, she flinched. Every male voice that rose above the low rumble of conversation made her spine go rigid. She held her bag on her lap like a shield and watched the fields of Ohio dissolve into the flat gray sameness of Indiana, and then Illinois, and she breathed. Each mile was a mile between her and Thomas Wick. Each mile was a small act of survival. A woman with a baby sat across from her somewhere outside of Cincinnati. The woman asked where she was headed. Clara said Montana. The woman's eyebrows rose in the particular way of someone who has heard something both impressive and alarming. Montana, the woman repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. You got family out there? Clara looked at the window. I have a future out there, she said. It was the first time she had said that out loud and meant it. But fear travels with you. It folds itself into your luggage and rides quietly beside your ankles. Somewhere in the flat stretch of Nebraska, in the deep dark of the second night, Clara woke from a short sleep and thought she heard Thomas's voice. Her whole body went cold. She sat up straight, her hands already shaking, her breath already shallow. It took her a full minute to understand it was the conductor calling out a stop. It took her another minute to remember where she was. It took her a long time after that to stop shaking. She arrived in Billings, Montana, 3 days later. The air was different. Sharper, cleaner, full of pine and something wild she could not name. A man from the trading post near Elk Ridge was waiting with a wagon, as the letter had promised. He was older, weathered, and said almost nothing, which suited Clara just fine. As they rode away from town and the land opened up around her, wider than anything she had ever seen, sky pressed down to the horizon on every side, she felt something unfamiliar move through her. Not safety. Not yet. But possibility. The raw, terrifying, genuine possibility that her life was not already over. The wagon wheels turned. The miles passed beneath her. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the horizon. Somewhere ahead, there was a man who had written her a letter about dignity. She did not know whether to trust him. She did not know whether she was capable of trust anymore. But she was here. She was moving. And for the first time in 3 years, the direction she was moving was forward. She had built a picture of him in her mind during the long days of travel. She had tried not to, she knew better than to hand her imagination that kind of power, but the picture had come anyway, piece by piece, assembled from old fears and older stories. She expected someone imposing, granite-faced, difficult to read. She expected the kind of presence that commands a room through sheer force, the kind of silence that feels like a threat. She did not expect the man who came to meet the wagon at the edge of the tree line. Running Bear was tall, yes. That part her imagination had gotten right. But his face was calm in a way that was not distant. It was the kind of calm that comes from choosing, deliberately, not to carry more weight than the moment requires. He was perhaps 40, with strong hands and dark eyes that moved slowly, taking things in rather than pushing them away. He wore a simple shirt and work trousers, not the ceremonial clothing she might have imagined, and he looked at Clara the way a man looks at something he respects, without hunger, without judgment, without the particular calculation she had learned to dread in Thomas Wick's gaze. You must be Clara, he said. His voice was low and even. I am, she said. Her own voice came out smaller than she intended. He nodded once and turned to help the wagon driver unload her bag. He did not linger over it, did not make a point of carrying it. He simply picked it up and walked toward the house. She followed, her feet uncertain on the unfamiliar ground, her heart making a sound inside her chest like a bird inside a box. The house was solid and warm and smelled of wood smoke and something herbal she couldn't identify. It was a modest place, one main room with a stone hearth, a table, 2 chairs, a kitchen area along one wall. A separate room through a closed door that she understood to be the bedroom. He showed her around quickly and without ceremony. He pointed out where the water pump was. He showed her the cellar where food was kept. He explained that the nearest neighbor was 2 miles east and that a woman named Dove, who was his cousin's wife, came twice a week to help with heavier work and would be happy to show Clara anything about the land she wanted to know. At no point did he stand too close. At no point did his voice take on an edge. At no point did he look at her in the way that told a woman her value was being calculated. That night they ate in near silence. He had made a stew, venison and root vegetables, and it was good, plain food that she ate slowly because she was not accustomed to eating at a table without watching the door. When she set down her spoon he looked at her and said, "You can stay in the bedroom. I'll sleep here by the fire until you decide what this arrangement will look like. There is no expectation tonight or any night you are not ready." She stared at him. "I mean that," he said and went back to eating. She did not sleep well. Old fear does not loosen its grip on the first quiet night. She lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the sounds of a land she did not yet know, wind in the pines, something distant and wild calling out, the low settle of the fire through the wall. But at no point during that night did she hear footsteps approaching the door. At no point did she hold her breath against a threat. And somewhere in the smallest hour before dawn, when the silence was complete and the darkness was total, she realized her hands were unclenched. She had not even noticed them unclenching. They had simply done it on their own, the way a body slowly believes what the mind is still afraid to accept. She was not safe yet. She knew that. A few hours in a strange house did not undo years of damage. But for the first time in a very long time, the danger she feared was behind her, not sleeping in the same room. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Clara learned the rhythms of the place the way you learn a new language, slowly, with many mistakes, with moments of embarrassment and moments of unexpected grace. She learned when the river ran high and when it was safe to cross. She learned which plants Dove said were good for headaches and which ones were not to be touched. She learned that Running Bear rose before sunrise every morning and sat outside facing east for a long time before he did anything else, and she learned not to interrupt that. She also learned that she was still afraid. Not of him, that had become clear to her faster than she expected, but of herself. Of the way her body still flinched when a door opened too fast. Of the way her voice still dropped when she had an opinion, as though opinions were things she had to apologize for. Of the way she caught herself watching his hands sometimes, not because they threatened her but because her body had its own memory, its own intelligence shaped by 3 years of damage, and that intelligence had not yet received the message that things were different now. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He was a man who paid attention. On the 23rd day she dropped a clay pot while washing it. It broke clean in 2 pieces on the stone floor. She froze. Her entire body seized with the old waiting, for the voice, for the footsteps, for the particular quality of silence that preceded violence. The waiting lasted only a second before she remembered where she was. But in that second she was completely somewhere else, completely back in Harrow Creek, completely in the body of a woman who had learned to be very, very still. Running Bear picked up the 2 pieces of the pot. He turned them over in his hands, unhurried. "Clay breaks," he said. "It can be replaced." He set the pieces on the table and went back to what he had been doing. That was all. Nothing more. But something in Clara cracked open that afternoon. Not in a bad way, in the way a seed cracks when it is finally ready to grow. She sat at the table after he went outside and she put her face in her hands and she cried. Not the short, swallowed kind of crying she had taught herself in Thomas's house. The silent, efficient kind that left no marks. She cried loudly and badly, in the way of someone releasing something very large that has been stored in a very small space for a very long time. He came back inside an hour later and found her at the table, eyes red, hands flat on the wood. He sat across from her. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not tell her it was going to be fine. He simply sat with her in the silence, present and steady, until she was ready to speak. "I was married before," she said finally. "I know," he said. "You didn't have to tell me." "He hurt me," she said. It was the first time she had ever said those words out loud, in that order, to another person. Running Bear was quiet for a long moment. "I am sorry that happened," he said. "It was not what you deserved." "I'm afraid," she said, "that I don't know how to be a person who isn't afraid anymore." He looked at her directly. His eyes were serious and kind in equal measure. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said. "It is the willingness to keep moving even when fear is present. You got on that train. You came here. You were afraid the whole way and you came anyway. That is not weakness. That is the most courageous thing I have seen in a long time." She looked at him for a long time after that. She wanted to argue as she always did when someone said something kind about her. Argue it away, deflect it, give it back. But she held it this time. She let it land. Outside the window, the river moved the way it always did, without hesitation, without looking back, forward and forward and forward, wearing the rock smooth with nothing but time and persistence. Spring came to Elk Ridge the way it came everywhere, first as a rumor, then as a fact. The ground softened. The river swelled. The trees along the ridge line put out their first tentative green, and the air lost its sharp winter edge and became something a person could walk through without bracing against it. Clara noticed all of this with an attention she had not known she possessed. She had spent so many years looking inward, watchful of the room, the door, the mood of the man, that she had nearly forgotten how to look outward. Now she was learning again. She and Running Bear had settled into something that was not yet love but was more honest than anything she had known with Thomas Wick, which was perhaps why it felt safer and why, paradoxically, it sometimes frightened her more. Love built on lies had a certain false security to it, a scaffolding that looked solid until it didn't. But what was growing between her and Running Bear had no scaffolding at all. It was 2 people choosing deliberately to be honest with each other, day by day, in a place where there was nowhere to hide and no audience to perform for. He taught her things. Not in the way of someone teaching a lesser person, but in the way of a man who loves the land and cannot help sharing it. He showed her how to read the sky for weather. He taught her the names of plants she had been walking past unseeing. He took her once, in early spring, to a place along the river where his people had held ceremonies for generations, and he explained what each marking on the rock face meant with the careful respect of someone who understands that history is not decoration, it is instruction. She listened with her whole self and asked questions when she had them, and he answered all of them without impatience. Dove became her friend. This surprised Clara more than almost anything else, that she could become friends with someone so easily, without the performance she had always associated with friendship. Dove was direct and funny and did not waste time with the polite social fictions that Clara had grown up practicing. If Dove thought Clara was being foolish, she said so. She thought Clara was being brave, she said that too. It was like standing in clear water after years of fog, and Clara drank it in. But the truest change happened in small things. In the morning she began to make coffee without calculating whether the sound of the grinding would wake someone and put them in a bad mood. She began to walk through the house without measuring her steps. She began to have opinions at the dinner table and say them out loud, and nothing terrible followed. Only conversation, sometimes disagreement, always resolution. She began to laugh without covering her mouth, and she noticed she had been covering it for years. One evening in late April, Running Bear came inside from the fields and found her singing softly to herself, a song her mother had sung her as a child, something about a river and a shore. She stopped when she heard him come in, the old reflex rising before she could stop it. But he just went to the basin to wash his hands and said without turning around, "Don't stop. It's a good song." She stood there for a moment. Then she finished the verse. Her voice was not strong and it was not trained and it cracked on the high note, and none of that mattered. In June she wrote a letter to her sister back in Ohio, not about Thomas, not about the escape, just about the mountains and the wide sky and a man who had surprised her in every possible way. She sealed it and walked to the trading post and mailed it herself. On the walk home she realized her steps were different. Not cautious anymore. Something had shifted in her gait, something she could not name but that her body had decided on its own, without waiting for permission from her fear. She was not a new woman. She was the same woman she had always been, the one who had pressed flowers in a Bible and believed in something better. Only now she had proof that the belief was justified. She had crossed the distance between that belief and this life. She had done it scared. She had done it alone. And on the other side she had found not a rescue but a partnership, not someone to take away her fear, but someone who showed her, by example, that fear and courage could exist in the same person at the same time, and that the choice between them was made new every single morning. She stood at the top of the hill behind the house and looked out at the land as the sun went low and the shadows stretched long across the grass. Running Bear stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that two people share when they have both survived something and understand that the survival itself is a kind of gift, one that doesn't ask to be explained, only honored. She had run from fear. She had run so far and so hard that she had ended up somewhere she never expected. And here, in this unlikely place, beside this quiet and courageous man, she had found the thing she had been running toward all along without knowing its name.